A soft morning light filtered through the towering sequoias of Redwood National Park on that June morning in 1951. The Sullivan family had spread a checkered blanket over the cool grass. Margaret Sullivan, in her floral dress, her blonde hair swept into a perfect bun, was preparing sandwiches while her husband Robert arranged the paper plates. "Michael, don't wander too far, sweetheart," Margaret called out, seeing her 6-year-old son scampering between the trees. The little boy in his plaid shirt and shorts turned to her with a smile that revealed a missing front tooth. "Just looking at the butterflies, Mom," he replied with the kind of innocence only a child possesses. Robert Sullivan watched his son venture a few yards further. "Let him explore a little, Maggie. We're on vacation and he's never seen trees this big." The park was moderately busy that Sunday. A few other families were enjoying the day like the Sullivans, while lone hikers traced the marked trails. In the distance, a park ranger chatted with a group of men. They were dressed in casual clothes, but their posture betrayed a certain military stiffness. "That's odd," Robert commented quietly. "It's the third time I've seen that military jeep half hidden among the trees. What are they doing here?" Margaret followed his gaze but shrugged it off. "They're probably doing some kind of survey. You know how the government is with its projects." Michael had found a small clearing where several monarch butterflies fluttered around a patch of wildflowers. He crouched down slowly, extending his hand in the hope that one might land on it, just as his father had taught him. From where he stood, he could hear the laughter of other children and the muffled conversations of adults. But he also sensed something else, a low, constant hum like an electric machine. Curious, he stood up and looked toward the sound. Barely visible between the trees, he made out what looked like a metallic structure covered in olive-drab tarps. Two men in uniforms without insignia were adjusting something on it. One of them glanced in his direction, and Michael, sensing he'd seen something he shouldn't have, instinctively stepped back. "Hey, little fella, what are you doing out here all by yourself?" A deep voice behind him made him jump. Michael spun around to find a tall man dressed like a hiker, but his military-style haircut and cold eyes clashed with his friendly smile. "I'm just watching the butterflies, sir," Michael answered, remembering his parents' warnings about talking to strangers. "My mom and dad are over there," he added, pointing toward the picnic area, though he could no longer see them from this angle. "Do you like animals?" the man asked, kneeling to meet his gaze. "You know, there's a doe with her fawn just up ahead. I can show you if you want." Michael shook his head. "I can't. I have to go back to my parents for lunch." The man nodded with understanding. "Of course I get it. It's just, well, it's not every day you get to see a baby deer this close, and it's right there, just a minute away." Meanwhile, Margaret was growing uneasy. "Robert, do you see Michael? I haven't seen him for at least 10 minutes. Robert stood up, scanning the area. "He's probably climbing on a fallen log. You know how he is." But a note of concern had crept into his voice. The minutes stretched on, and their calls of Michael grew increasingly frantic. In the clearing, Michael had decided he really did want to see the fawn. "Just for a minute," he thought. "Mom won't even notice I'm gone." He followed the man who offered him a hand. Michael hesitated but finally took it. They walked a few yards into a denser part of the forest. Not far away, two other men appeared from between the trees. "Is that him?" one of them asked, his voice tense. "Yes," the first man replied curtly, his grip tightening on Michael's hand. A sudden fear gripped the boy. "I want to go back to my mom," he said, trying to pull his hand free. "Sorry, kid," the man replied as one of his companions pulled a white handkerchief from his pocket. "You saw something you shouldn't have." The last thing Michael would remember of that day was the sickly sweet smell of chloroform and the blurred image of the sequoias reaching for a sky that was growing darker and darker. Back in the park, panic had erupted. Rangers organized search parties, visitors formed groups to comb the area, and Robert Sullivan, his voice cracking, described his son to a police officer. Light brown hair, blue eyes, a small scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike last summer. Margaret, sitting on the picnic blanket, clutched the small teddy bear Michael had left behind. Her eyes, dry from crying, stared fixedly into the forest as if by sheer force of will she could make her son emerge from the trees. 100 yards away, a military jeep started its engine silently, carrying an unconscious boy hidden under a tarp. And so, on a day that had begun with laughter and sandwiches, Michael Sullivan became another one of America's missing children. His case soon to be filed away as a probable fall into a ravine or an attack by a wild animal. What no one knew then was that this story, far from ending, was only just beginning, and that it would take 73 years for the truth to come to light. On June 17, 1951, more than 2 miles from Redwood National Park, a boy awoke in a sterile, white-walled room. The fluorescent light hurt his eyes as he tried to figure out where he was. It wasn't his bedroom with the constellations his father had painted on the ceiling, nor was it any place he could remember. "He's awake!" a woman's voice announced. Michael tried to sit up, but he felt weak and dizzy. A woman in a nurse's uniform approached his bed. "Where's my mommy?" he asked, his voice trembling. The nurse offered him a glass of water. "Drink this, William. You'll feel better." "My name isn't William," he protested weakly. "I'm Michael. Michael Sullivan." The nurse exchanged a look with a man in a white coat who had just entered the room. The man came closer and sat on the edge of the bed. "Listen to me carefully," he said in a voice that was both authoritative and kind. "You've been very sick. The fever has made you confused. Your name is William Hayes. You are an orphan, and you are now a ward of the United States government." Michael shook his head. "No. My dad's name is Robert and my mom is Margaret. We live in Oakland and I have a dog named Rusty." The doctor sighed and pulled a syringe from his pocket. "You need more rest, William. In time you'll understand." In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. Every time Michael insisted on his real identity, he received an injection that plunged him into a deep sleep. When he awoke, they would show him photographs of people he didn't recognize, telling him they were his parents who had died in a car accident. "Your parents, James and Eleanor Hayes, died 3 months ago," Dr. Lewis would explain patiently, showing him forged newspaper clippings. "You suffered a trauma and created false memories as a defense mechanism." Meanwhile, in California, the search for Michael Sullivan continued, though with less intensity. After 2 weeks with no results, the authorities began to favor the theory of an animal attack. Scraps of blood-stained clothing were found near a ravine carefully planted by the same men who had taken him. Colonel Frank Donovan personally supervised the operation from a military base in Rhode Island. "How is the conditioning process going?" he asked over a secure phone line. "Progressing as expected," Dr. Lewis replied. "The subject still shows resistance, but he mentions his previous life less each day. The memory replacement therapy is working." "Excellent," Donovan approved. "We need him ready for adoption in a month. The assigned family is eager." "May I ask, sir, why the specific interest in this child?" Lewis ventured. A tense silence hung on the line before Donovan answered. "You only need to know what's essential, Doctor. The boy was exposed to significant levels of radiation during our experiment near Redwood. We need to monitor him closely for the next few years, but discreetly. A military family is the perfect cover." In California, the Sullivans were living their worst nightmare. Margaret had lost so much weight that her clothes hung on her frame as if they belonged to someone else. Robert spent his days combing the park for any sign of his son, refusing to accept the official conclusion. "He's not dead," Robert insisted to the local sheriff. "I know my son. He's smart and careful. Someone took him." But with no evidence to support his theory, the authorities gradually closed the case as a tragic accident. Only one park ranger, Thomas Clark, continued to support Robert's search, intrigued by the strange behavior of certain government researchers who had been in the park that day. "Something doesn't add up, Mr. Sullivan," Clark confided to him one rainy afternoon. "Those men packed up their equipment and vanished as soon as the search began. They didn't even offer to help." At the military facility, Michael, now forced to answer to William, was beginning to yield to the constant psychological pressure. After weeks of conditioning, medication, and the relentless repetition of his new history, the memories of his former life were growing hazy. One August morning, Dr. Lewis entered his room with a satisfied smile. "Good morning, William. How are you feeling today?" The boy looked up from a coloring book. His eyes, once bright and lively, were now dull and confused. "Fine, sir. Do you remember who you are?" There was a moment of hesitation, a final flicker of resistance before he answered. "William Hayes. My parents died in an accident." Lewis nodded, pleased. "Excellent. I have good news. A family wants to adopt you. Captain Richard Hayes and his wife, Marta. They don't have any children and are very excited to meet you." Later that day, a middle-aged couple entered the room. The man, tall and rigid, wore a civilian suit, but his haircut and demeanor screamed military. The woman, thin and with a nervous smile, held a new teddy bear. "Hello, William," she said, approaching cautiously. "I'm Marta, and this is Richard. We've come to take you home." The boy looked at them with no apparent emotion. A deep part of him screamed that something was wrong, that these weren't his parents, that his home was somewhere else, but that voice had grown so faint he could barely hear it beneath the layers of conditioning. "Will I have my own room?" was the only thing he asked. Richard Hayes smiled, satisfied with the program's success. As an intelligence officer assigned to Project Horizon, he knew exactly what had happened to the real Michael Sullivan. His mission was to ensure the boy never remembered his past, while doctors monitored the long-term effects of the experimental radiation exposure. A week later, William Hayes arrived at a tidy suburban house on the outskirts of New Haven, Connecticut. Far from the sequoias of California, he would begin a new life built on lies and secret military science. In his new room, as Marta unpacked his few clothes, William looked out the window at the backyard. For a fleeting instant, he remembered another yard with a swing set and a golden retriever running in circles. He blinked, and the image was gone. "Is everything all right, dear?" Marta asked, noticing his lost expression. William nodded slowly. "Yes, Mom." The word felt strange in his mouth, as if it belonged to someone else from another time. But with each passing day, Michael Sullivan faded a little more and William Hayes took his place. The files in the Oakland Police Department's basement gathered dust. Solved, unsolved, and abandoned cases rested in boxes labeled by the decade. In 2024, Detective Jack Reynolds, just weeks from his mandatory retirement, was spending his last afternoons reviewing old cases that had always intrigued him. Reynolds, a 63-year-old man with a full head of white hair and deep lines around his still sharp eyes, had a particular obsession with unsolved child disappearances. Perhaps because he never had children of his own, or maybe because his first case as a rookie detective had been one just like this. "Still chasing ghosts, Jack?" asked Diane Martinez, the department's archivist, as she handed him a coffee. Reynolds smiled without looking up from the yellowed file in front of him. "These aren't ghosts, Diane. They're real people who deserve justice, even if it comes late." The case he was reviewing that afternoon was that of Michael Sullivan, who disappeared in 1951. He'd stumbled upon it by chance while researching another disappearance in Redwood National Park. You know what gets me about this one? He mused, showing her a black and white photograph of a smiling boy. The way they closed it. They found blood-stained clothes but never a body, and the father insisted until the day he died that his son was kidnapped. Diane shrugged. Parents always hold on to hope. It's understandable. It's more than that, Reynolds insisted. Robert Sullivan kept a detailed journal of his own investigation. He wrote about unusual military activity in the park that day, about a ranger who saw unauthorized jeeps, about men with military haircuts dressed as civilians. Over the next few days, Reynolds poured all his free time into the Sullivan case. He dug into military records for activity near Redwood National Park in 1951. Most were classified or had been destroyed, but one document, declassified in 2006, briefly mentioned Project Horizon, a study on the effects of radiation on various ecosystems. Why would you classify a simple ecological study? He muttered to himself as he drove to the apartment of Thomas Clark, Jr., the son of the ranger who had supported Robert Sullivan in his search. Clark, Jr., a 70-year-old man who had followed in his father's footsteps as a park ranger, greeted Reynolds with an initial caution. That caution, however, turned to keen interest the moment the Sullivan case was mentioned. My father never believed the official story, he explained, rummaging through an old box of personal effects. Before he died, he gave me this and made me promise to keep it safe. From the box, he retrieved a worn-out notebook in a yellowed envelope. These are his personal notes on the case, he said, and something he found in the park weeks after the disappearance, near the area where that military equipment was set up. Inside the envelope was a partially burned military insignia bearing the initials PH and a symbol Reynolds didn't recognize. Project Horizon, he murmured. Back in his apartment, Reynolds spread all the information across his table. With the meticulousness of a veteran detective, he began to connect the dots: the secret project, the undocumented military presence, the perfectly orchestrated disappearance. Something in the old ranger's notes caught his eye: the mention of 3 specific officers present that day. One of them, Colonel Frank Donovan, had overseen several classified projects during the Cold War. Reynolds spent days tracing Donovan's history, only to discover he had passed away in 1997. His obituary, however, mentioned his protege and close colleague, Captain Richard Hayes. Hayes, Reynolds repeated, a nagging feeling that the name should mean something. After several searches through military databases, he found it. Richard Hayes had adopted a child in 1951, approximately 1 month after Michael Sullivan's disappearance. The boy, supposedly an orphan, was named William Hayes. A coincidence? He wondered, digging deeper for information on William. What he found left him breathless. William Hayes had enjoyed a distinguished career in the Marines, decorated for his service in Vietnam. Now retired, he lived in a quiet suburb of New Haven, Connecticut. The few available photographs showed an older man, but with one distinctive feature that made Reynolds's pulse quicken: a small scar on his chin, identical to the one Robert Sullivan had described on his missing son. Reynolds printed the clearest photograph he could find of William Hayes and placed it next to the one of Michael Sullivan. Using basic forensic software, he projected what the boy's face might look like as an adult. The resemblance was undeniable. I found you, Reynolds whispered to the photograph. After 73 years, I finally found you, Michael. But his discovery raised more questions than answers. Why kidnap a child only to give him a new identity? What had Michael really seen that day in the park? And what did William Hayes know about his true origins? Reynolds knew he needed more proof before he acted. Sifting through declassified old medical records, he found cryptic references to juvenile test subjects in documents related to Project Horizon. The dates aligned perfectly with Michael's disappearance. One night, while poring over digitized files from the labs involved, he found a partially redacted document. Subject MS accidental exposure to levels 3-4. Extraction required for long-term monitoring. Covert operation authorized by D.I. Donovan, Reynolds deduced. They had accidentally exposed Michael to radiation and then kidnapped him to cover it up and study him. The theory was confirmed when he located a retired nurse who had worked at a military facility in Rhode Island in 1951. Though reluctant to speak at first, the elderly woman finally confessed to participating in the reconditioning of a boy from California. "I never knew his real name," she admitted, her voice trembling. "We just called him William. We had orders to make him forget his previous life. They used drugs, hypnosis, techniques that would be considered psychological torture today. I've always regretted my part in it." With enough evidence to justify a formal investigation, Reynolds prepared a detailed report for his superiors. The night before he was to submit it, however, he received an anonymous call. "I know what you've discovered, Detective Reynolds," a male voice said. "There are powerful people who would prefer this story remain buried." "Is that a threat?" Reynolds asked, his body tensing. "On the contrary, I'm offering you help. I work for an oversight agency that investigates historical abuses of classified military programs. Your case could be the key to exposing decades of cover-ups." The next day, instead of going to the department, Reynolds flew to Connecticut. At 63, with retirement just around the corner and no family who could be threatened, he had decided to confront William Hayes directly. As his taxi pulled up to a modest Victorian house in New Haven, Reynolds felt the weight of 7 decades of lies he was about to dismantle. He wondered if the man inside, a decorated veteran who had served his country with honor, was prepared to discover that his entire life had been built on an elaborate lie. With grim determination, he walked to the door and rang the bell. After a moment, the door opened to reveal an older man with an upright posture and a piercing gaze. "William Hayes?" Reynolds asked. "Yes," the man answered, his voice firm. "How can I help you?" Reynolds took a deep breath. "My name is Jack Reynolds. I'm a detective from Oakland. I'd like to talk to you about Redwood National Park and about who you were before you became William Hayes." William Hayes observed the detective with a mix of confusion and caution. His eyes, a blue faded by time, narrowed slightly as he sized up the man on his doorstep. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally replied, his hand tightening on the cane he used for support. "I've never been to Redwood." Reynolds held his gaze. "Could we speak inside? What I have to say isn't something we should discuss on the porch." After a moment's hesitation, Hayes stepped aside. 15 minutes. That's all you get." The interior of the house reflected the life of a retired military man. Orderly, functional, with framed photographs of his time in the Marines and service medals carefully arranged in a display case. Reynolds noted the absence of any childhood photos. "My wife Martha passed away 5 years ago," Hayes commented, gesturing to an armchair in the living room. "So forgive me if the place feels a bit stark." Reynolds nodded, taking a seat. "Mr. Hayes, before I begin, I want you to understand that I'm not here to disrupt your life. I'm investigating a case from 1951, and I believe you may have crucial information." "1951, I was just a boy then," Hayes responded matter-of-factly. "I don't see how I could possibly help you." Reynolds pulled 2 photographs from his briefcase, one of Michael Sullivan smiling at the camera, and another of William Hayes at 18 in his Marine recruit uniform. "This is Michael Sullivan," he said, indicating the first photo. "He disappeared from Redwood National Park on June 17, 1951. He was 6 years old. Hayes looked at the photograph with no apparent reaction. And this, Reynolds continued, showing him the second image, is you, 12 years later. I noticed something interesting. You both have the same scar on your chin. Hayes unconsciously brought a hand to his chin, where a thin white line was barely visible among the wrinkles of his skin. A lot of kids fall off bikes, Detective, he replied coolly. Scars aren't fingerprints. Reynolds pressed on with methodical calm. I also found records of Project Horizon, a radiation experiment conducted near Redwood in 1951, and documents that mention the extraction of a subject, MS, who was accidentally exposed. An almost imperceptible twitch appeared in Hayes's left eye. That sounds like a rather elaborate conspiracy theory, Detective. Are you suggesting I was, what, kidnapped? Reprogrammed? It's absurd. I have testimony from medical personnel involved in the reconditioning of a boy from California in Rhode Island, Reynolds continued, and records of your adoption by Captain Richard Hayes, a close collaborator of Colonel Donovan, the project supervisor. Hayes rose abruptly, leaning on his cane. I think your 15 minutes are up, Detective. My father adopted me legally when I was orphaned. I served my country honorably for 30 years. I will not have you tarnish my family's memory with these fantasies. Reynolds remained seated, his voice quiet but insistent. Have you ever had unexplained memories, Mr. Hayes? Images of places you've supposedly never been? Dreams of people you don't know but who feel familiar? The question seemed to strike Hayes like a physical blow. For an instant, his mask of indignation cracked, revealing something deeper. Fear, confusion, doubt. We all have strange dreams, he finally muttered. Reynolds retrieved another object from his briefcase, a small worn teddy bear. This belonged to Michael Sullivan. His mother kept it until the day she died, hoping that one day her son would come home. Hayes stared at the toy, his expression unreadable. Why are you showing me this? Because for years I've investigated missing children, Mr. Hayes, and I have never found a case with so many coincidences, with so much circumstantial evidence, all pointing to a buried truth. I believe you are Michael Sullivan. A heavy silence filled the room. Hayes walked slowly to the window, gazing out at the garden where autumn leaves were beginning to fall. When he spoke, his voice was distant, as if coming from another time. I have dreams, always have. Giant trees that touch the sky, a blonde woman singing while she cooks, a golden dog running around a swing set. He turned to face Reynolds, his features etched with an emotion that seemed to have been unearthed from the depths. My father, Richard, told me they were fantasies, products of a fever that nearly killed me after my birth parents died. In time, I stopped mentioning them. Reynolds stood, approaching him cautiously. The Sullivans lived in Oakland. They had a golden retriever named Rusty. Margaret, Michael's mother, was blonde, and she sang in the church choir. Hayes closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they bore into Reynolds with a haunting intensity. Show me more. For the next several hours, Reynolds methodically laid out the evidence he had gathered. Photographs of the Sullivans, newspaper clippings about the disappearance, declassified documents from Project Horizon, witness testimonies. Hayes listened and watched in silence, occasionally asking a precise question. His military training was evident in the methodical way he processed the information, as if analyzing enemy intelligence. If what you're saying is true, he said at last, why now? It's been over 7 decades. Because crimes against children have no moral statute of limitations, Reynolds replied. Because Margaret Sullivan died 3 years ago, still clinging to the hope of finding her son, and because the people responsible for this must face justice, however late it may be. Hayes rose with difficulty and walked to a small desk. From a drawer, he pulled out a worn notebook. I started having nightmares after Vietnam. The military psychiatrist suggested I write down the recurring dreams. He said it might help me process them. He opened the notebook to a marked page. I drew this 40 years ago. I never knew what it meant. The drawing showed a clearing in a forest of giant trees with a metal structure covered in tarps nestled between the trunks. A chill ran down Reynolds's spine. "It's the Project Horizon equipment," he murmured, just as the park ranger described it in his notes. Hayes turned a few more pages, revealing other drawings. A house with a front porch, a park with a lake, blurred faces that now, compared with the photographs Reynolds had brought, bore an unsettling resemblance to the Sullivans. "My whole life," Hayes began, his voice cracking for the first time. "My whole life I've had these fragments in my head, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit anywhere." Reynolds placed one final photograph on the table, the symbolic grave of Michael Sullivan in Oakland. They never found his body, so they erected this. Margaret visited every week until her health made it impossible. Hayes touched the photograph with trembling fingers. "She never gave up." "No," Reynolds confirmed. "Robert died in 1989, still searching for answers. Margaret carried on until the end." A silence, heavy with 7 decades of secrets, filled the room. Finally, Hayes looked up, his eyes now wet but resolute. "What do we do now, Detective?" Reynolds managed a faint smile. "That's up to you, Mr. Sullivan." Reynolds's phone vibrated with a message. As he read it, his expression grew serious. "My contact at the Oversight Agency. They've agreed to open a formal investigation into Project Horizon and the subsequent cover-up. But they need your testimony." Hayes, or perhaps Michael now, nodded slowly. "A life built on lies," he murmured. "I faithfully served a country that stole my identity." "You also saved lives," Reynolds reminded him. "Your actions in Vietnam, your decorations. That was real, regardless of how you got there." The old man straightened up with renewed determination. "I need time to process this, and then I want to see Oakland. I want to see the empty grave and the house where I was apparently born. I want to piece together what they took from me." Reynolds nodded in understanding. "I can arrange that, and there's something else you should know. Margaret Sullivan had a younger daughter, Sarah. She was only 2 when you disappeared. She's still alive, living in Sacramento. She's 75 now." "A sister," Hayes whispered, the word sounding foreign on his tongue. "I have a sister." As the sun began to set over New Haven, 2 men, one at the end of his career, the other at the end of a life built on a lie, continued to unravel the truth of a crime that had remained hidden for 7 decades. And somewhere between the shadows of the past and the revealing light of the present, William Hayes began the painful process of rediscovering Michael Sullivan. The plane began its descent into Oakland International Airport, under a California sky that looked uncannily like the one from 1951. William Hayes, who now wrestled internally with the possibility of being Michael Sullivan, stared out the window with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Are you all right?" Reynolds asked from the seat beside him. Hayes nodded slowly. "It's strange, I've never been here, and yet something about the shape of those hills feels familiar." In the 3 days since Reynolds' visit to New Haven, William Hayes had endured what his doctor might have described as a severe identity crisis. He spent hours poring over the photographs of the Sullivans, searching for features he could recognize in his own aging face. He reread the newspaper clippings about the disappearance as if they were chapters from a novel, starring a stranger who was, somehow also him. "Have you considered a DNA test?" Reynolds had suggested during one of their long phone calls. "Who would I compare it with?" Hayes had retorted. "Both parents are dead and I'm not ready to contact Sarah." He still couldn't bring himself to call her my sister. The detective had then proposed another approach. "Let's go back to the beginning. Let's visit the places. Sometimes places can stir memories that photographs can't." And so it was that William Hayes, at 79 years old, found himself landing in a city that may or may not have been his true home. "I've booked a car," Reynolds explained as they collected their luggage. "I thought we could start with the Sullivan house. It's still standing, though it's been renovated several times." Hayes walked with the aid of his cane, his military posture still evident despite his age. "Do you know who lives there now?" "A young family." I explained the situation, and they've agreed to let us visit the exterior. Understandably, they're a bit uneasy about letting strangers inside. The drive from the airport passed in contemplative silence. Hayes watched the city pass by with the keen eye of a man searching for clues in a complicated case. Occasionally, his gaze would linger on an old building, a park, the curve of a road, as if trying to connect what he saw with the fragments of memory that had been buried for 7 decades. "There it is," Reynolds finally announced, pulling the car to a stop in front of a 2-story Victorian house, painted a pale blue with white trim. Hayes sat motionless in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the structure. Without a word, he opened the door and slowly got out. He stood on the sidewalk, leaning on his cane, absorbing every detail. "The porch," he murmured at last. "It was smaller, and there was a tree there," he said, pointing to an empty spot in the yard. "An oak." He stopped abruptly, surprised by his own words. Reynolds, standing beside him, nodded. "The oak got sick and was removed in the 70s, according to city records. The porch was extended in a renovation in 1983. Hayes moved slowly up the walkway, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. Suddenly, he turned left and walked to the side of the house. "There was a window here," he said, pointing to a section of wall that was now solid siding. "My room. I used to sneak out of it to play after dark, even though I was forbidden to go out alone." Reynolds stared at him in astonishment. "That's not in any record, Mr. Hayes. The window was removed in a 1962 renovation. There's no way you could have known that unless I really lived here," Hayes completed, his voice barely a whisper. A young woman came out onto the porch, watching them with cautious curiosity. Reynolds approached and spoke with her briefly. After a few moments, the woman nodded and gestured for them to come closer. "Leslie says we can see the backyard," Reynolds explained, rejoining Hayes. "Apparently, when they bought the house 3 years ago, they found something buried that might interest us." The backyard was small but well tended, with flowers bordering a neat lawn. Hayes scanned it, his eyes stopping on a particular corner. "The swing set was there," he murmured, "and we buried my goldfish under that bush when it died." Leslie, who had followed them at a respectful distance, came forward holding a small metal box. "We found this when we were planting the hydrangeas. We didn't know if it had any value to anyone, so we kept it." Hayes took the rusted box with trembling hands. Opening it, he found a small, hand-painted metal toy soldier and a blue marble. "Captain America," he whispered, his eyes suddenly moist. "My father. He painted it for my birthday. I lost it right before—" He couldn't go on. For the first time since Reynolds had appeared at his door, William Hayes, now more and more convinced he was Michael Sullivan, allowed emotion to crack his military facade. A single tear traced a path down his wrinkled cheek as he held the toy as if it were the most precious artifact in the world. "Thank you," Reynolds said to Leslie, who discreetly retreated, understanding the gravity of the moment. Later, sitting in a nearby cafe, Hayes stared at the toy soldier on the table. "It's real, isn't it?" he said finally. "Everything you've shown me, everything I've started to remember." "I am Michael Sullivan." Reynolds nodded. "I believe so. And I believe a part of you always knew, buried under decades of conditioning and a life built on that initial lie." Hayes, Michael, carefully placed the toy in his pocket. "What's the next step?" "The cemetery," Reynolds replied. "And after that, if you feel ready, we could visit Sarah Sullivan Thompson. I've told her about our visit, but I made it clear it would depend on how you felt." Mountain View Cemetery was quiet that afternoon. Reynolds led Michael to a section where two headstones stood out under the shade of a sycamore tree. One belonged to Robert Sullivan, who died in 1989. The other to Margaret Sullivan, who passed in 2021 at the age of 98. Between them sat a small memorial plaque. "Michael Sullivan, beloved son, 1945 to 1951, forever in our hearts." Michael knelt with difficulty, leaning on his cane before the graves. He remained silent for a long time, the decades of separation, a tangible chasm between him and the people who had brought him into the world. "They never stopped looking for me," he murmured at last. "Their whole lives." "Robert investigated until the day he died," Reynolds confirmed. "Margaret kept your room untouched for decades. When she finally converted it into a study, she packed all your belongings into meticulously labeled boxes. Sarah told me her mother would open those boxes every year on your birthday." Michael touched his mother's headstone with trembling fingers. "She lived so long, and I was alive the whole time, just a plane ride away." He pushed himself slowly to his feet, his face set with a new determination. "I want to see her. Sarah, if she's willing." The drive to Sacramento was quiet. Michael watched the California landscape, occasionally pointing out places that sparked flashes of memory. A park where his father had taken him to fly kites, a roadside diner where they used to stop on family trips. It's like someone hit pause on a movie for 70 years and is now pressing play again, frame by frame, he explained. But so many scenes are still missing. Sarah Sullivan Thompson's home was a cozy single-story house with a lush garden. A woman with white hair was waiting on the porch, her tense posture betraying her nervousness. Beside her, an older man. Her husband held her hand for support. Michael got out of the car slowly, leaning on his cane. He stopped halfway up the driveway, suddenly unsure. Sarah took a step forward. At 75, her blue eyes, the same eyes as Michael's, held a mixture of hope and caution. "Michael?" she asked, her voice trembling. He gave a slight nod. "It seems so, though I'm still getting used to the idea." Sarah approached slowly, studying his face with intensity. "You have Mom's eyes and Dad's chin." "And the scar?" Michael added, instinctively touching the mark on his chin. "From when I fell off the new bicycle." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "You remember that? You were so little when you disappeared. I was barely 2. "Not everything," he admitted. "Just fragments, but with every hour I spend here, more pieces seem to fit." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah closed the remaining distance between them and, with tears in her eyes, embraced the brother she had lost 7 decades ago. Michael, initially rigid from surprise and a lifetime of military reserve, slowly raised his arms and returned the hug. Reynolds watched from a discreet distance, aware he was witnessing the resolution of one of the most extraordinary mysteries of his career. But he knew this reunion was only the beginning. There were still questions to be answered, culprits to be identified, and a full truth to be unearthed about Project Horizon and the men who had stolen Michael Sullivan's life. The law offices of Mercer and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a glass high-rise in downtown San Francisco. Michael Reynolds and Sarah met there with Elaine Mercer, a lawyer specializing in litigation against the federal government. "What you're telling me is extraordinary," Mercer commented after hearing the full story, her salt and pepper hair framing a face that had seen decades of legal battles. "And also extremely difficult to prove in a court of law. We have the documentary evidence Detective Reynolds compiled," Sarah argued. "And now, the memories my brother is recovering." Mercer nodded, glancing through the file. "Yes, but we face several obstacles. First, the statute of limitations on many of the crimes. Second, the classification of crucial documents. And third, the fact that the key players are likely all dead." Michael, who had been silent, finally spoke. "I'm not looking for financial compensation, Ms. Mercer. I'm looking for the truth. I want to know exactly what happened, why they chose me, and I want the government to officially acknowledge what they did." "That might be more feasible," Mercer conceded, "especially with the current climate of transparency regarding historical classified experiments. But we'll need more than circumstance and coincidence." Reynolds intervened. "My contact in the Oversight Committee suggested we could petition for the declassification of specific Project Horizon documents under the Freedom of Information Act, backed by the evidence we already have." "A sound approach," Mercer agreed. "We should also pursue DNA testing to definitively establish the kinship between Michael and Sarah." The meeting continued for hours, mapping out strategies and reviewing documents. In the end, Mercer agreed to represent them, warning that the process would be long and potentially frustrating. 3 days later, Sarah and Michael provided samples for DNA analysis at a specialized lab. While they waited for the results, Reynolds continued his investigation, now with access to additional resources provided by his anonymous contact in Washington. One rainy afternoon, Reynolds called Michael with significant news. "I've found someone, a former military doctor who worked directly on Project Horizon. He's alive, in a nursing home in Maryland, and he's willing to talk." The Sunset Meadows retirement home was a placid complex on the outskirts of Baltimore. Dr. Edwin Morris, 93, received them in a small common room, his frail body a stark contrast to the sharpness in his eyes. "I knew you'd come one day," he said after they explained their purpose. "I've lived with this guilt for too long." Morris had been a young doctor assigned to the project in 1951. As he explained, Project Horizon was not simply a study of radiation in ecosystems as the declassified documents suggested. It was a research program on the effects of radiation on human development, he revealed, his voice brittle but clear, particularly on children. The thinking was that children, being in a growth phase, might adapt better to low levels of exposure. Michael went pale. "You were experimenting on children, deliberately?" Morris shook his head. "Not officially. The authorized research was on accidental exposure and its aftermath, but some officers, led by Donovan, interpreted that liberally." "What exactly happened in Redwood?" Reynolds asked, recording the conversation with Morris's consent. The old doctor closed his eyes as if visualizing that day. "We had set up equipment to measure radiation absorption in different natural environments. One of the machines had an unexpected leak. Several children playing nearby were potentially exposed." "And why abduct Michael specifically?" Sarah interjected. "Because he saw the equipment," Morris replied. "The operation was meant to be discreet, but the boy wandered too close. A technician saw him observing the machine right after the leak. Donovan made the call. Rather than risk a scandal if the boy mentioned what he saw and later developed symptoms, they decided to extract him for monitoring." "Extract him," Michael repeated, his voice tight. "You destroyed a family. You stole my identity." Morris nodded, shame plain on his face. It was monstrous. I was young, fresh out of medical school. When I raised ethical concerns, they threatened to ruin my career. I should have spoken up. How many others? Reynolds asked. Were there other children taken? Not in the same way, Morris answered. Michael was a special case because he'd seen too much. But there were other children monitored discreetly over the years without their families' knowledge. Children from orphanages, mostly. Fewer questions. Michael leaned forward. And what did you find? Did I have effects from the exposure? Morris shook his head. That is the ironic end to this terrible story. Your continuous scans never showed any significant radiation effects. The exposure was likely minimal. All that suffering for nothing. They left the nursing home with more answers, but also a heavier weight. Morris's confirmation provided crucial details, but it also revealed the sheer scale of the government cover-up and the clinical coldness with which a child's fate had been decided. That night in his hotel room, Michael had the most vivid nightmare yet. He saw himself, small and terrified, in a white room as men and women in lab coats asked him questions. They showed him pictures, gave him injections. He woke up shouting, drenched in cold sweat. They weren't just dreams, he murmured when Reynolds rushed to his room. They were memories. They were systematically erasing me, replacing my parents with strangers, my home with a lie. The next day, two significant pieces of news arrived. First, the DNA results came back, confirming beyond any doubt that Michael and Sarah were brother and sister. Reynolds's persistent pressure had finally paid off. The first batch of documents from Project Horizon had been declassified. The files, though heavily redacted, provided a detailed timeline of what they internally called the Sullivan incident. They confirmed the accidental exposure, Donovan's decision to secure the subject, and the cognitive reconditioning process Michael had undergone. They also revealed something no one had anticipated. Richard Hayes, the man who had adopted and raised Michael, had initially opposed the plan. Captain Hayes had voiced strong ethical objections to the procedure of extraction and reassignment. Michael read from one of the documents. He only agreed to participate when informed that the alternative would be the subject's permanent institutionalization. Michael read that section several times, the conflicting emotions clear on his face. He knew everything, he thought, but at least he tried to protect me in his own way. It seems he gave you the best life he could under the circumstances, Sarah observed gently. The documents also named the three men directly involved in the abduction. Lieutenant James Weber, who had first approached Michael, Sergeant Paul Delaney, who had administered the chloroform, and Captain Thomas Miller, who had driven the jeep. Of the three, only Miller was still alive, now 97 and living in a hospice facility in Arizona. We should talk to him, Reynolds suggested. Bring it full circle. Meanwhile, Elaine Mercer had formally presented her case to the Department of Defense, demanding official recognition, an apology, and the complete declassification of all related documents. The initial response was administrative silence, but as fragments of the story began to leak to investigative journalists, thanks to Mercer's careful strategic placements, public pressure mounted. A California senator, intrigued by the case, convened a preliminary hearing of the Subcommittee on Ethics in Historical Military Research. Michael, Sarah, and Reynolds were invited to testify, alongside experts in medical ethics and civil rights. The night before the hearing, Michael called Reynolds to his hotel room in Washington, D.C. "I've been thinking," he said, gazing out the window at the illuminated Washington Monument, "about identity, about who I really am." Reynolds waited, sensing Michael needed to voice something important. Michael Sullivan died in a way that day in Redwood. he continued. And William Hayes lived a full life. He served in Vietnam, got married, had a career. I can't just erase those 7 decades, even knowing how they began. No one expects you to, Reynolds replied. You're the product of both lives, the one that was stolen from you and the one you built. Michael nodded slowly. Tomorrow, when I sit before that committee, I want them to understand that I'm not seeking revenge. I'm seeking reconciliation with my past, with my country, and with the man I became. The next day, television cameras captured the moment Sullivan Hayes, as he had chosen to identify himself, sat before the senatorial panel. His perfect military posture, despite his age and the cane resting against his chair, conveyed a dignity that moved even the most skeptical senators. My name, he began, his clear voice resonating through the chamber, is Michael Sullivan Hayes. 73 years ago, I was the victim of an injustice perpetrated in the name of national security. I am here today not to assign blame, but to ask you to acknowledge this buried truth, so that no other child is ever again sacrificed on the altar of government secrecy. As he spoke, screens displayed alternating photographs. Michael at 6 years old smiling beside his biological parents, William Hayes in his Marine uniform, and finally the elderly man who now sought to reconcile these two identities, torn apart by an act of inconceivable institutional cruelty. The Desert Sunset Hospice in Phoenix, Arizona, was a low-slung complex of buildings surrounded by gardens of cacti and desert flora. Michael and Reynolds crossed the quiet lobby where the conditioned air was a stark contrast to the searing heat outside. Mr. Miller is having one of his good days, the nurse informed them, guiding them down a hallway decorated with watercolor landscapes of the Southwest. But I should warn you, his lucidity comes and goes. Thomas Miller, the last survivor of the trio that had abducted Michael in 1951, lay in a bed next to a window overlooking the garden. At 97, his body was consumed by age and terminal illness, but his eyes, gray and piercing, held a surprising clarity. I knew you'd come, he said, his voice a dry rasp as Michael entered the room. I've been waiting for you for decades. Michael stopped by the bed, studying the man's face. He searched for a flicker of recognition, some connection to his fragmented memories. But Miller was a stranger. Do you remember me? Miller asked, a bitter smile curving his cracked lips. No, Michael answered honestly, but I remember the smell of chloroform, and I remember the fear. Miller closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the blow of those words. I deserve your hatred. I've carried it with me my whole life, like a stone in my conscience. Reynolds remained near the door, discreetly recording the conversation with prior consent from both the medical center and Miller himself, who had agreed to provide a full testimony. I didn't come here to hate you, Michael clarified, taking the chair beside the bed. I came to understand. For the next hour, Thomas Miller recounted his version of the events of that June day in 1951. He confirmed what they already knew about the radiation leak and Donovan's decision, but he added details that were absent from the declassified documents. Weber saw you first, he explained. You were looking right at the machine when the leak happened. You walked away, but he was sure you'd been exposed and that you'd seen too much. Michael nodded. I remember the metal frame and a humming sound. Donovan was already on edge about the location. Miller continued. The project was supposed to be in unpopulated areas, but he insisted on testing different ecosystems. When he heard about the incident, he panicked. If it got out that we had accidentally exposed a child to radiation. Why not just monitor me discreetly? Michael asked. Why the abduction, the new identity? Miller coughed weakly before answering. It was more than just the exposure. Weeks earlier, another child in Nevada showed symptoms after a similar test. He died 3 days later. The government covered it up, secretly compensated the family with a story about a rare infection. Donovan was terrified the same thing would happen to you, and that this time they wouldn't be able to contain the story. Reynolds stepped closer. Are you saying they took Michael not just to monitor him, but to make sure that if he died from the exposure, no one could connect it to the project? Miller nodded slowly. That was the Cold War mindset. Any scandal could be exploited by the Soviets. National security trumped everything else, even the life of a child and the suffering of a family. Michael processed this revelation in silence. Finally, he asked, and later, when it was clear I wasn't developing any symptoms? By then, it was too late, Miller replied. The reconditioning program was too far along. Michael Sullivan was officially dead, and William Hayes had begun to exist. Donovan argued that reversing the process would cause more trauma than good. The conversation continued, with Miller revealing how the team had carefully manipulated the scene in the park, planting evidence to suggest an animal attack. He described the guilt that had tormented Weber until his suicide in 1963, and how Delaney had spiraled into severe alcoholism. What about you? Michael asked. How have you lived with this? Miller stared at the ceiling. I became religious. I sought redemption in faith. I left the army and worked for 40 years as an elementary school teacher, trying to balance the scales somehow. But it was never enough. His gaze returned to Michael. When I saw your testimony on TV last week, I knew I had one last chance to do the right thing before I die. From under his pillow, he pulled out a yellowed envelope. I've kept this all these years. It's my full confession, signed and notarized. It includes details that aren't in any official document. Names, dates, locations, everything I know about Project Horizon and what they did to you. Michael took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. Why now? Why not before? Fear, Miller admitted, and shame. For decades, I told myself it was for the greater good, that you were just a boy and you'd get over it, that they gave you a good life with the Hayes family. He paused, his breathing labored. But those were lies I told myself to sleep at night. The truth is, I was a coward. Reynolds approached. Mr. Miller, would you be willing to make a videotaped statement? It could be crucial for the case. Miller nodded. It's the least I can do. My doctor says I have weeks, maybe days. I want to leave with as clear a conscience as possible. As Reynolds stepped out to arrange the formal recording, Michael was left alone with the man who had helped shatter his life. I saw you once, Miller said unexpectedly. In 1967. You were in your Marine uniform shipping out to Vietnam from San Diego. You didn't recognize me, of course. I followed you for years from a distance. I saw your commendations in the papers. I saw when you married Martha. Michael looked at him, stunned. Why? I wanted to make sure you were okay, that at least that part of the lie was true, that you had a good life. Miller coughed again. And maybe in my twisted mind, if your life turned out to be a success, it somehow justified what we had done. A long silence settled between them. Finally, Michael spoke. I can't forgive you on behalf of my parents. The suffering you, all of you, caused them is unforgivable. Miller closed his eyes, accepting the deserved blow. But, Michael continued, I can choose not to let hatred consume the years I have left. So I will leave you to your conscience, which seems to have been punishment enough. 3 days later, Thomas Miller's videotaped confession was presented to the Senate committee. His testimony, along with the documents he had preserved, provided the definitive evidence Elaine Mercer needed for her case. The Department of Defense, faced with irrefutable proof and mounting public pressure, finally conceded. A week later, Michael received a call from Reynolds. Miller passed away last night, the detective informed him. Peacefully, apparently, after his confession. Michael received the news with a mix of emotions. The last direct witness to his abduction was gone, taking with him an era of government secrets and questionable ethics. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked when he told her the news. They were sitting on the porch of his home in Sacramento watching the sunset. "Like one circle has closed," he answered after a moment's thought. "But another is just beginning." "What do you mean?" Michael smiled faintly. "For 73 years, I was two different people without knowing it. Now consciously, I have to decide who I want to be with the time I have left." Sarah took his hand. "Maybe you don't have to choose. Maybe you can be both. Honor the boy you were and the man you became." As the sun disappeared below the California horizon, Michael Sullivan Hayes looked toward the future with a clarity he hadn't felt in decades. The truth, however painful, had brought an unexpected freedom. The freedom to reclaim all the fractured parts of his identity and, at last, to decide his own fate. The next day they would receive the official notification. The United States government had agreed to a public hearing of acknowledgement and a formal apology. The Sullivan-Hayes case would become a landmark precedent for future investigations into covert experimentation. And Michael had been invited to help create a memorial for all victims of non-consensual government experiments. Justice, however late, was finally beginning to dawn. Redwood National Park stretched majestically beneath an exceptionally clear October sky. The giant sequoias, silent witnesses to centuries of human history, cast long shadows across the clearing where Michael Sullivan had vanished 73 years ago. Michael, leaning on his cane, surveyed the spot with a storm of emotions. Beside him, Sarah watched her brother's face with concern. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked softly. Michael nodded. "I need to. This is where it all started, and this is where it needs to end." The ceremony scheduled for that afternoon was the result of months of negotiations. Following Miller's confession and the subsequent investigation, the Department of Defense had issued its formal apology. Today, in the presence of government officials, the press, and the families of other identified victims of Project Horizon, a memorial would be dedicated. "Jack should be here," Michael remarked, referring to Reynolds, who had died suddenly of a heart attack 3 weeks prior. The detective hadn't lived to see the final fruit of his tireless search for the truth. "He would know," Sarah replied. Somehow he would know." Since the case had become public, Michael's life had changed dramatically. His story had captured the nation's attention, becoming a symbol of Cold War covert operations and their human cost. He had received hundreds of letters of support, speaking invitations and offers for books and films. But today was not about media attention. Despite the cameras and dignitaries who would soon arrive, this was an intimate, personal moment. Michael walked slowly to a specific point among the trees, guided by a memory that had grown sharper in recent months. "It was here," he said, stopping. "I was watching monarch butterflies when I saw it, the equipment covered in tarps, and then Weber spoke to me about a fawn." His voice trailed off as the memories, now painfully clear, flooded his mind. For decades, these moments had been buried under layers of psychological conditioning, surfacing only as fragments in dreams. Now standing on the exact spot where his life had been irrevocably altered, the memory crystallized with an almost overwhelming clarity. "I can see it all," he murmured. The uniform hidden beneath a hiker's outfit, the way the man had gripped his hand when he tried to pull away, the white handkerchief. Sarah held his arm, anchoring him as he navigated the painful currents of memory. Slowly, the clearing began to fill with people. Members of the press arrived, along with government representatives and the families of other identified victims of Project Horizon. In the crowd, Michael recognized Elaine Mercer, who had fought tirelessly for his case, and David Reynolds, the detective's son who had traveled from Oakland to represent his father. The ceremony began with an official statement, a formal acknowledgement of the facts. The unauthorized radiation experiment, Michael's abduction, and the subsequent cover-up. The Department of Defense official, visibly uncomfortable, offered an apology on behalf of the United States government. When it was time to unveil the memorial, Michael was invited to the podium. The monument, a simple bronze plaque mounted on a granite boulder, bore the names of all the known victims of Project Horizon, headed by Michael Sullivan and William Hayes. Michael looked out at the assembled audience, took a deep breath, and began to speak. 73 years ago, on this very spot, a 6-year-old boy had the misfortune to see something he shouldn't have. That boy was me, though for most of my life I never knew it. His voice, steady despite his age, resonated with a clarity that held everyone captive. They stole my identity, my family, my history. I was given a new name, new memories, and a life built on lies, and yet I am not here today to speak of resentment, but of reconciliation. He paused, his eyes scanning the attentive faces. As William Hayes, I served this country honorably, the very same country whose government had stolen me. I fought in Vietnam, received medals for bravery, got married, and built a life. I cannot and will not disown those 7 decades. They are as much a part of me as the 6 years I lived as Michael Sullivan. Sarah in the front row smiled at him through tears. This memorial, Michael continued, gesturing to the plaque, is not just for me. It is for all who were sacrificed on the altar of national security, for those whose lives were altered without their consent, and it is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of our nation's history, the truth eventually comes to light. After the official ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Michael remained by the memorial, lost in thought. An elderly woman approached him shyly. "Mr. Hayes, or should I say Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael smiled kindly. "Either is fine." "I'm Eleanor Weber. James Weber was my father," she replied. "The man who approached you that day." Michael looked at her in surprise. "I didn't know he had any children." Eleanor nodded. "I was 4 when it happened. I didn't know anything until I found his journals after he died. He wrote at length about what he'd done, about his remorse. He took his own life when I was 16. "I'm so sorry," Michael said, and he meant it. "I'm the one who should be sorry," she replied, "for what my father did to you, what they all did." Michael took her hands gently. "Your father was part of a larger system, and he paid the ultimate price for his actions." As they spoke, David Reynolds approached with a small package. "My father wanted you to have this," he said, handing it to Michael. "He left it in his will, specifically for this day." Michael carefully opened the package. Inside was a detective's shield, polished and bright, with the name Jack Reynolds engraved on it. "He said you solved this case as much as he ever did," David explained, "and that this shield always represented the search for truth, no matter how long it took." That night, Michael and Sarah returned to the clearing, now deserted except for the new memorial, illuminated by the moonlight. Michael sat on a nearby bench, gazing at the redwoods that had been silent witnesses to so much suffering. And finally, redemption. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked. "Time," he answered after a moment. "These trees have been here for thousands of years. They've seen empires rise and fall, wars begin and end. My story, It's just a blink of an eye to them. Sarah smiled. But it's our story, and now it's complete. Michael nodded slowly. Yes, in a way it is. But it's also a new beginning. In the months that followed, Michael would divide his time between Connecticut and California, reconnecting with his family history while simultaneously honoring the life he had built as William Hayes. He began to write his memoirs, not as an exercise in self-pity but as a historical testament and a warning to future generations. His case triggered a full review of Cold War government experimentation files, leading to the identification and compensation of dozens of other victims. The Sullivan-Hayes Government Research Transparency Act was introduced in Congress with broad bipartisan support. 1 year after the ceremony in Redwood, Michael returned to the park alone. At 80 years old, he knew this would likely be his last visit. He walked to the memorial, now a familiar sight to park visitors, and placed two objects upon it: the small toy soldier he'd found buried in the garden of his old home in Oakland, and Jack Reynolds' detective shield. As he walked slowly away down the path, a monarch butterfly fluttered before him, its orange wings glowing in the California sun. Michael stopped, watching it land briefly on a wildflower, exactly as one had done on that June day in 1951. For a fleeting instant, he felt time fold in on itself. He was that 6-year-old boy again, filled with wonder at the world's beauty, before the cruelty of adults had shattered his innocence. The butterfly took flight, vanishing into the sunbeams filtering through the giant redwoods. Michael smiled and continued on his way, carrying with him the peace that comes from finally knowing the whole truth and the freedom, in his remaining years, to decide who he wanted to be. Not just Michael Sullivan, not just William Hayes, but the unique sum of both lives, both stories intertwined by fate, science, and finally, justice. In the depths of the forest beneath the redwoods that had witnessed his entire story, the circle was finally complete.